I might have figured out the secret to my easy sleeps, or easily falling asleep. Eat a heck of a lot of rice for dinner. So I just had rice with some Indian sauce, and I was resting again at 8:30, and then I just kind of laid there for an hour, feeling like I was kind of sleepy. And I had taken my 6 caps of the Hardy's amino acids at 8:30, so I waited until 9:30 to take my meds, and then I just went to sleep. And it was easy enough. And that was the first night of taking the 1/8 dose. And the last 2 nights I've been listening to a Krishnamurti audio on YouTube to fall asleep. And I used to do this every night when I was back home because I lived in a noisy neighborhood. But when I got to California, I realized it was so quiet that I just wanted to listen to the sound of silence as I fell asleep. And sometimes it's noisy with people noise around where I stay, so I usually wear earplugs. But lately, since that first night when I was sleepy, I was actually listening to a Krishnamurti talk on YouTube. So I wasn't sure if it was the rice or the Krishnamurti talk, but last night I did both. And interestingly enough, I woke up at some point because I thought I heard a knock at my door. And I just heard like one knock, but maybe a couple other faint knocks. But the one knock woke me up. And it was sort of similar to how that scary heart energy wakes me up, but I didn't feel afraid. But I woke up, and as soon as I woke up, then I could hear the Krishnamurti talk that I was listening to. And right at that moment, he was talking about telepathy and being able to read people's thoughts, and how when the body becomes extremely sensitive, we can get connected to those types of powers and psychic powers and things like that. But he is one to also say that it's important not to get caught up in those things, because it's kind of like playing with a children's toy. You can just get stuck in that, and there's something that could be even beyond all that. Like by focusing on one thing, if I could all of a sudden read people's thoughts and then I decided to devote my whole life to that, I wouldn't be accessing the richness, which might include reading people's thoughts every now and then a whole dynamic thing of other aspects the rest of the time. And I don't know if that's what he's saying exactly, because who can really say what he's saying exactly? Because Krishnamurti is Krishnamurti. But it was interesting that there was a knock sound, and I don't know if it was from the Krishnamurti audio or if it was just the sound, almost like a so-called hallucination, to wake me up at that moment so I could hear that, because I like those bits that he talks about, because it's referring to high sensitivity and how we can have access to powers. And if Krishnamurti's saying that, then it must be true. But anyway, I think there's some kind of equivalent process that happens in map consciousness. We get sensitive and we don't know how to be with that, so we can get caught up in some of these powers, and that can actually mess it up, because it's one thing to get caught up in the powers and use them for the rest of our life, but most of us get caught up in the powers, and actually that is the demise of the whole thing. So it could be important to understand that moving through this is to not form any beliefs around the uses of these powers, and just drop them like any thought or belief that comes along the way, or any experience, not clinging to them. So I didn't listen to all he was saying about that, but it's in a talk on YouTube called Jiddu Krishnamurti, What is Meditation? And in brackets, Truth and Actuality. And it's on Vinay's channel, and it's at about, I would start at about 55 minutes, but it sounded like it was about 59 minutes and 30 seconds in. And he also talks about these powers in the series of talks he had with Alan W. Anderson. He had a series of about 18 talks, and in the last talk which is something called meditation part 2. He talks about being in connection with these powers and then sort of leaving them alone. Because the thing too is, if we leave them alone, then those powers will arise when we need them. Not by any act of will, but if we try to cultivate the powers, then we're actually putting some element of will and desire and ego structure into it, and that's where it gets messy. And that's where it gets messy in so-called mania too. So even when I say harvest, practice, embody, that could be dicey because we could be practicing traits that we want. And so it's still important to be in contact with the whole rich spectrum of the moment. Sort of doing a bunch of cross-training of the powers, but not willing them in any certain direction. Just being able to refine to some extent the channels through which all this energy can go through us, not trying to augment any particular channel, but definitely negating all the channels that are the ego. And by doing the negation of the ego channels, that will naturally just channel energy into these other channels that are trying to develop. And I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's okay. But I just found it interesting that some element woke me up to hear that, because I was having a conversation with someone yesterday and I was telling them about how in that in-between space between falling asleep and being awake, when trying to fall asleep, that's when some weird stuff happens. And they told me about an experience where they were laying in bed, opened their eyes, and a door opened and they saw something walk in the room and then go behind, and a sensation on their head. And then after that, they opened their eyes and saw the door open. So it's, to me, sounded like dreaming within a dream or something. And I've had an experience like that where I was dreaming that something was grabbing me from behind, and then I woke up and I jumped out of my bed and I ran downstairs and got in my mom's bed. And this was like, I don't know, 10 years ago or something. And then after that, I fully felt like that happened, and then I woke up and I was in my bed laying on my back like this. So it was like waking up within a dream, kind of like Inception or something. I don't know, but I just thought it was interesting because the way they described it, it was something about how the brain can create a hallucination to wake us up or something. So it'll create a door knocking, so then we wake up. Not that anyone was at the door, but that for some reason we're supposed to wake up. And then the same night that happened where there was this knock sound, I woke up and it was the exact part of the Krishnamurti talk that I needed to hear to sort of bookmark that in my investigation. And that's actually been happening a lot lately, where something will happen and then something will happen related to that. It's sort of a synchronicity, but not. It's more of this confirmation of synchronicity rather than an actual synchronicity. Like talking about the marching band analogy and then going to the park and there's a band playing. It wasn't a marching band, but it was a band ensemble of trumpets and trombones and all that. And those sort of things have happened probably like 10 times in the last week, or maybe 2. So it's almost the beginning of synchronicity, possibly. And I definitely tossed and turned throughout the night, and I slept very lightly. I woke up too warm because the heater was on in my room, and then I took off my pajamas, and then I went back it took me a while to fall back asleep. My legs kind of hurt, probably from rollerblading and hiking. And then I was dreaming, and then I was kicking around, and my blankets were pretty much off the bed. And usually I wake up in the morning and I just sort of fold the blanket over and get out of bed, like I haven't moved the whole night. So these last couple nights I've definitely been more restless, and I don't think that's a bad thing. It could be I'm just not so drugged and laying there drugged, sleeping because of that. So I'm sure there's an adjustment period there. still feel rested. I feel a little bit tired, but rested for sure. And the other thing that happened yesterday is I was editing my 2 videos, and I was saying in the video, oh, I'm kind of glad that I'm not really extrapolating much from this. I have these 2 little pages left, and when I was editing the last 2 videos, I took a bunch of notes and wrote them in my phone. Quite a bit, probably a video or 2 worth of notes. So it seems like whenever I say something like, oh, I slept so good, this is it, the next night I don't sleep good, or, oh, I'm glad I'm not extrapolating these videos when I'm editing, and then boom, there's a bunch of extrapolation, and I'm feeling more clear, and that could also be a little scary, because that's sometimes when it seems like I hit the ceiling of moving with that wave of consciousness and that wave of perception, and then it retreats and retracts back to something like 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And the 1 step back feels intense. So I'm going to be a little bit cautious these next few days. I'll probably talk about those extrapolations later. I even kind of wanted to talk about them yesterday because they were more fresh. So we'll see what happens. Maybe these extrapolations will continue. I have till June 20th for the 1-year process, so that's okay. I have about 20 days until then, and 20 videos until I'm at 300 videos. Not that that matters, but 300 videos in 1 year, and then continuing until September 11th for the real year in terms of how often I was doing it. And yeah, so I will talk to myself a little bit more later about those extrapolations. It seems I'm kind of tired today, and I feel really full, maybe from eating all that rice, and then this morning I had the usual muesli, a big bowl of that. So I'll probably have a small lunch and then maybe just have juice for dinner. I'm feeling like I need to not eat quite so much. So onto the stuff I extrapolated from yesterday's video. I talked about how it seems like we go back to that time before we were really programmed, when we were learning in this dynamic way that seems to be reactivated in so-called bipolar. So it's almost like we go back to being 7 years old. But the part that I thought of after watching my video was that since we learn so fast in that state, we can catch up fast. So we go back to 7-year-old kind of reality testing and trying to test out new rules and test the rules, because in that space there are no rules. So the rules are kind of made up moment to moment sometimes. But we can catch up fast because it's a hyperlearning state. We learn so fast as children, and then we go to school and learn from books and things, and that way of learning gets turned off, and it actually slows down how we learn. And I remember when I first went into map consciousness 6 years ago, around the time it first started, I started really connecting with some of the Disney songs of my childhood, like the song that Ariel sings in The Little Mermaid about all her stuff that she has in her cave. And I actually had the sense like my life story was the same as hers, and I almost really strongly identified with it. And when I was thinking about how it seems like we go back to that 6 or 7-year-old state, back to the time when that enormous process of learning was sort of shut down and turned off, that would have been a time when my brain would have thought like that. I would have actually identified with Ariel and maybe felt like I was her, or I could be her, or something like that. So I just thought that that was something that points a little bit more to how my brain did kind of go back to that childlike state. And it also sort of was thinking about the lessons in those movies, like The Little Mermaid, Aladdin, The Lion King. Those were the three that sort of went through my mind. And as time went on, I started to listen to music of my early teens, and I couldn't really listen to the music that I listen to now, which is usually upbeat, electronic type music. It seemed way too fast. And I wrote down, that world unfolds when we are in that heart space, the art of perception and action. So can I design this as a lifestyle? Can I experiment with this when I go home and just live in perception action without delay? And go from this pseudo-synchronicity that's happening now to synchronicity, which is kind of a personal subjective phenomena, to synergy, which requires synchronizing with other beings. And kids seem to have their own intelligence, which they co-create with the moment. That intelligence directs their learning, and they don't learn just from reading books about something. And I wanted to finish a point about the whole idea that the ego is a hallucination or a delusion. So feeding energy into this creates what we feel are outside the range of the me, which we call actual hallucinations. But I think the whole process is a hallucination. And I wrote down a few things that were kind of more in the airy-fairy range, which feels less like an extrapolation and more like a statement, like a direct download from something else, like channeling something. And an example of that is I wrote, there is no person separate from the process. When you see that, you are everything. So that's not really an extrapolation. It's kind of like, where did that come from? It sort of arose through me, just like the other things, but it has a little bit of a different tone, kind of like a teacher or something. So maybe a teacher can arise through a being. Instead of reading it in a book, you can just channel it, and I don't know, but I'll read those things anyway. But sometimes when I start writing those things, that's when I'm reaching those upper limits. And a lot of my old notebooks from 2 years ago, before I had my first reoccurrence of map consciousness, after I tried to taper off meds then, they were more like statements, like direct insights. And can human beings get with the creation of that totally different dimension or category in the mind, in the brain, like Krishnamurti talks about? Can we get out of the way and support that dimension and category to come into being? And I thought of another way to think of momentum when I was saying it's moment-om. And it could stay moment-um, but be momentum, meaning pause in the moment. Say wonder, and say I don't know. So can we go from memory to moment, pausing in the moment and allowing something to arise in the space of not knowing, versus immediately meeting each moment with memory and giving continuance to that. And then I get a little bit into that insight where it's sort of a statement. You'll start being surprised at what you do. I don't know unlocks all directions, all possibilities. Be artful in the unknown. Allow the unknown of you to unfold. You'll watch your life unfold. Watch your show instead of thinking you are the subtitles. Maybe this is why we feel like we're on TV when we connect with that state. It's the best language we have to describe the felt sense of that witnessing state. So what I was thinking with that was how when we're in memory and meeting life with memory all the time, we live in the commentary. We live in the subtitles, which often have nothing to do with what's actually happening in the moment. So it's actually worse than living in the subtitles. It's like living in the subtitles of a different movie than you're actually watching. So when we really connect with map consciousness, it could be one of the reasons why we feel like we're on TV or somebody's watching us and we're in a movie or our life is a movie. And I've heard it called the Truman Show delusion, how after the Truman Show came out, more people showed up in the psych ward feeling like they were on the Truman Show or feeling like their life was like the Truman Show. And so they're saying that the context of what is out there in society sometimes contributes to the types of delusions people have. And I don't know if that's exactly true. To me, in thinking about it right now, it could be more so that in watching that movie, if one connects with map consciousness, that movie has given a person the language or context to put words to the felt sense of what that feels like. So by watching that movie, and then say somebody goes into map consciousness later in life, they might feel like they're on the Truman Show because they watched the Truman Show, but it's not because they watched the Truman Show, it's because the Truman Show gave them that language to kind of describe the sense that they could understand the character in the show must have been feeling. And I've talked about this a few times in different ways, how we don't know how to give voice to some of these felt sensations, but since our brain operates on translating everything into words and thought, and according to the past, it will reach into that bank to try to translate and make sense of why this shift in orientation feels like this. So even with me creating all this context for myself, I had a so-called crisis in January, but part of me talking to myself all this time was a factor in me being able to avoid the psych ward. And I would talk to myself, and I've been talking to myself, and then I watch the video to edit it. So in that way, I'm kind of watching my own movie. And in watching my own movie, when I have a strange felt sense of something that comes up that is not part of the regular consciousness I try to maintain for functionality's sake, then my brain might actually look into my own movie that I've created for myself of all this context to help to give words to the felt sense of that. So what I'm saying is it's not necessarily that the Truman Show caused people to have Truman Show delusions. It's that movies in Hollywood are really good at creating a lot of different stories around these strange phenomenon that actually do happen to people. And then oftentimes we actually just see it in a movie. And it could be because people who created these movies or helped to write the scripts might have had these types of sensations and then created a movie around it. But it's actually a lot of these different movies, a lot of these different psychological thrillers or psychological drama type movies have elements that people actually experience. So I think the elements that people experience actually happen before and have always been happening, and then someone happens to make a movie about it, and then people happen to go to the psych ward saying they feel like this movie character because it's the best way to kind of describe that sensation. And there could be infinite sensations of these different types that are hard to put into words, that there could be 1,000 movies about. And if somebody has happened to see some of those, if they happen to have a sensation similar, they might say, oh, you know the Matrix, it kind of feels like that. Or you know the Truman Show, it kind of feels like that. Or you know Donnie Darko, it kind of feels like that. Or you know I Origins, it kind of feels like that. And there's so many of those movies, and I watch those movies and I can see things that I have touched on experiencing in the movies, and so it doesn't actually feel like a fake movie. Actually, before I went into that mini crisis in January, I was watching that show, Original Angel, the OA, and that crap is real, man. It is messed, and I only watched half the first season, and my brain was already going into those expanded states because it's been there. So to watch things that tease my brain into those states, that show actually played into some of what I experienced in those states. So it is kind of a reciprocal thing. I think watching those things can invite some of that. If there's an out there experience, it invites the brain to lean towards translating it or creating that experience in the direction of the recently watched psychological type movie. So me personally, I have to be careful what I watch, because even watching The Arrival the other day, my brain has seen certain things about non-linearity and non-locality and things in my past experiences, and is almost translating it in terms of that. Just certain bits, not all the bits, but the bits that were like that movie start to arise in consciousness. And since there's a movie that is an hour and a half and it points to all these different phenomena, the brain starts trying to make sense of some of past experiences that it hasn't yet made sense of with the help of that movie. So this can be good, and it can also be a little bit scary or fascinating. It's fascinating, but it gets scary when the brain starts moving too quickly. And one thing I'm going to ask Hardy Nutritionals is how long these drug residues stay in my body, and how long does it take for them to leave, and do things like infrared saunas help to move the drug residues out of the body? And I'm also thinking of doing a ketogenic diet for a month, and that can cause weight loss, and weight loss is fat, and when the fat leaves the body or melts away, that could actually release a bunch of the toxins. And that was one of the other interesting pseudo synchronicities when I was mentioning that earlier, was I was thinking, oh, I want to ask Hardy Nutritionals about ketogenic diet and saunas, and whether I'm in danger of, if I do some detox, experiencing some more drug withdrawal because it's still in my system. And maybe it's not good to do a ketogenic diet yet because of that. And so I wrote that in my calendar so I'd remember to ask them, because that is how I remember stuff. And that's the only way I can remember stuff, if it's sort of a scheduled thing. Otherwise, it seems to arise naturally when need be. But anyway, I'm reading Dr. McCullough's book, Fat for Fuel, and I had left off at a certain spot. I just read it on my Kindle app on my phone whenever I have a few minutes. And the next page I turned to, it said on there, be careful on a ketogenic diet because the rapid weight loss, if you just go right into the ketogenic diet cold turkey, all these toxins and things can be released into the body because they're stored in the fat cells. So that was another one of those pseudo synchronicities. And it seems to be like the brain asks a question and then the answer arrives in something that somebody was just naturally participating with anyway. And it's just really interesting how it seems to be right where I left off in that book, and then I turn the page and there it is. I'm still going to ask Hardy Nutritionals, but these are the pseudo synchronicities that there have been too many of them to attribute to chance. And the thing is, when the brain gets more clear, the universe is able to respond in more clear ways more quickly. So it becomes something that is really expected almost. They're surprising, but not surprising at the same time, because it's like the universe is on our side and helping us out to find the answers in the context of life. And that's why I feel like, too, it's difficult to watch too many movies or TV or news or read books by other people, because it can cause my brain to just go into hyper extrapolation and see the beyond of everything everybody's saying. And that's another benefit of self-dialogue, is it's a way to still engage in learning without having to read other people's things and have the brain go kind of wild. It's like the brain is in such a creative state that other people and their hard work and what they're doing cause the brain to go even further beyond than if it was not to do that. Now, if everybody was just communicating in this way and learning from themselves and from each other in daily life, then maybe this wouldn't necessarily be a problem. And a lot of people talk about too much information. It's sort of the age of way too much information. Well, for people like me with bipolar, even just a small amount of information can be too much information, because each bit of information contains a lot of different possible extrapolations that the brain can choose to unfold. And so one has to kind of protect oneself from that. So Jason Silva mentions bandwidth anxiety in some of his videos. Well, I feel like I have bandwidth anxiety in a different way. It's if I read stuff, I will create too much bandwidth of my own. So it's actually the opposite. It's staying away from the bandwidth, knowing that my brain can't really, it's not that it can't process it, it'll go beyond, it'll create from that priming. And Steve Pavlina talks about priming. Well, I feel like being primed from my own dialogue is enough. And that means maybe it's not the most well thought out thing in the world, but it's just this flowering that there's no one there to control it. So one has to have other mechanisms of keeping it in check. When we learn the whole, but really this is when we learn when it's like a flowering, not a linear process from books and adding to memory. And related to what I was saying about the Truman Show thing is that if I share this and anyone watches a certain length of it who has experiences of these types of consciousness, it might help to create some language and understanding around some of it, so that we don't necessarily have to rely on movies to help us create some language through which we can describe to people how this sensation feels. So now it generally feels like something out of a movie, whether it's a Truman Show movie or a Matrix movie or something. But when we have enough language to talk about it, and we speak that language, and we're able to speak the language of those sensations and orientations and perceptions and perspectives and states of energy and consciousness, then we don't have to just say, oh, this feels like the Truman Show. We might actually be able to unfold what it is like. And that's sort of what I've been doing by talking to myself, is creating that language and thinking of it in a lot of different ways. So if I go into map consciousness, I don't have to just feel like, oh my gosh, this is the Truman Show. Or the last time it was a lot of scary alien stuff, and I didn't have to think, oh, this is like that alien movie where somebody had their brain zapped or whatever. I could just hold it within all the context I've created by hearing myself say all of this and saying it from the moment and from my own perceptions and understandings. Creating this understanding for myself, not having the brain go back to rely on understandings that we got from the entertainment industry. Like, how much of our life do we have to get from the entertainment industry? And even when we say it feels like this or it's like that, that's still not it. That's still not the essence of the sensation. It's just a way of telling other people or telling ourselves how that feels. But if we hold on to that, if we feel like this is the Truman Show, or my state feels like the Truman Show, and then we believe that, then we're actually limiting the unfolding of the richness. So if we're able to let go of that, that story related to that sensation might actually drop. And then we might go on to the next movie, or we might just go on to something completely different that we have no words for. And that's part of this self-dialogue, is just keep talking to create words for things that aren't things, that are states, that just 1 second of that sensation or that felt sense or that state of being might create thousands of words, which still wouldn't do justice to that state of being. So, as Krishnamurti would say, the word is not the thing. Or as Korzybski would say, the map is not the territory. So even mapping out map consciousness is not map consciousness. And there is no real map for map consciousness.